You're watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and for the next half an hour, we're going to talk about the rumours from the Mirror about things that are going to be happening with old Doctor Who episodes for the 60th anniversary, so you don't have to. I am JR.
I am Matt.
I'm Simon.
And so we did hear this rumour, and Matt, you kind of wanted to bring up one aspect of it, and I think it's also worth talking about another aspect of it too. So we'll probably divide this conversation in half. So in the second half of this conversation, you'll hear about missing episode finds.
Yeah, that'll go viral. That's sure to win them. Like people won't have just turned off for the sight of us.
In the second half of this episode, we'll be talking about the animations and what's been said about that. Potential animations, because as things stand, this is currently still only a rumour, and whether we think possibly this does mean something for missing episodes fans. And it's an old story that circulated so many times in the last 10 years that everything with a pinch of salt, of course, but we'll get there. And I think there is a little bit of a discussion worth having about that. But the other thing that was in this story, and the story was more widely put about by TV Zone, but it was a Nicola Methven story in the Mirror, or in the Mirror Online. And as we've discussed before, Nicola Methven, who's the TV editor, tends to try only to put her name to Doctor Who stories if she's fairly sure they're going to turn out to be true. If she thinks they're going to turn out not to be true, she has other people's names that she puts to those. Although she doesn't always get it right, because she said Doctor Who was coming back to Saturdays with season 12, and that didn't turn out to be true. But anyway, the story is that in the 60th anniversary, there will be 2 stories animated for Doctor Who fans that'll be released on presumably Blu-ray, and that some other stories, and the hint was that they'd all be William Hartnell stories and that they would include the very first story, were going to be colorized so that they could be broadcast. First of all, before we talk about the rights and wrongs of colorizing old black and white telly, because I think that's kind of what you wanted to talk about, Matt, do we think when they hinted that it would be just Hartnell that that's true, or do we think that maybe, you know, a couple of Hartnells and a Troughton for variety? I mean, if they were going to do several, surely they'd do some Troughton too, wouldn't they?
I mean, my first reaction is An Unearthly Child would be a fairly boring story to colorize, set mostly in a cave with, you know, grey cavemen, whereas something like Daleks would be slightly more interesting.
Well, I don't know, Daleks, there's lots of grey corridors. The one thing about Unearthly Child is you've got a bit of jungle, sort of forests going on there.
Yeah.
But potentially the flip side of that is, if something's going to be boring, it's probably going to be less troublesome and cost less to animate. So it might be that that's a reason too. Who knows?
The Aztecs would be interesting. If you look at So I was looking for the purposes of talking about colorization at the color photos that exist of sets to see if the costumes seemed to be selected for specific black and white purposes, and the Aztec costumes in the color photos are incredibly vivid. And we know that Marco Polo is, but they're not going to colorize Marco Polo, it not existing.
Ooh, just keep your ears open for the second half of this conversation.
Yeah. That's not going to go viral. But yeah, something like the Aztecs, but then the Aztecs is historical, so I don't know.
I would have thought, I mean, I don't know exactly the technicalities of the process, but something like An Unearthly Child, at least for 3 out of 4 episodes, you've got a limited palette. Because my understanding is if it's a computerized system where you essentially tell it which shades should be which colours, then you can apply that to the last 3 episodes. So most of the effort's going to go into that first episode, I would have thought, but I don't know.
I think with the colorizing AI, you can kind of upscale to HD as you color. I think there's one of the suggestions I sort of heard. Okay. So that also would be helpful, wouldn't it? Especially as, you know, with the exception of season 2, which has just come out, the other seasons are potentially all going to be released on Blu-ray at some point. So all of this work can go towards helping out with sort of getting those ready. But yeah, I think Simon's right. If you're talking about a sort of limited series of sets, you can program the computer to know what color those sets are supposed to be. So something like the jungle. See, I think the thing with An Unearthly Child is it's less limited. I think the jungles and that probably make it more tricky rather than less tricky, because those trees and things are gonna present the computers with much more problems than, say, clothes, where sort of distinctive outlines are going to help, I should have thought.
I think there's also a balance between choosing stories which are easier to colorize, and for the first few, choosing stories that would be an excellent showcase for colorization. So if you choose a particularly grey looking story, then people will just look at it colorized and go, well, what was the point in colorizing it? It doesn't look that much. Like Hartnell looks slightly pinker, and that's about it.
Bring on the mind robber. That's what I say.
Well, yeah, the mind robber would be amazing if they, you know, if they don't go full authentic and just, you know, go for it with colorization.
Yeah, and to be honest, in Hartnell's, probably the historical ones were the ones that probably would be more interesting, you know, in those terms, because a lot of the sci-fi ones are either in corridors or spaceships or whatever. There's a lot of grey going on there.
And also the historical ones, and this ties in with what I'm wanting to say, I'm assuming the costumes are the types of costumes that are being rented from the theatrical costumier. And presumably if they're rented from the theatrical costumier or the theatrical costume store, then they're not going to be greys. They're going to be brightly coloured because they're designed for the stage rather than television. If they're the sci-fi ones, they might have been made specifically for the TV, so they wouldn't have them particularly brightly coloured, I guess.
Well, they, for instance, yes, like the TARDIS console being a kind of pale green, so that it looks white on screen but doesn't disappear. Because if it had been just actually white, it would kind of disappear on screen instead. Yeah. So things like that would be the case. The costumier as well. Presumably, you'd have records, or at least you'd have reference to what those costumes would be coloured like. So things like shading and you know, even just the colours themselves would be easier to source, you know, accurate sources for. So yeah, all of that. Do you want to get into the reason why you brought this up then, Matt? Because I think we're probably thinking the same thing, aren't we?
Well, so the reaction to it, possibly predictably, was split between. I'm slightly agnostic about it. I'd be interested to see it, but I don't really give a monkeys that much. But there are reactions to it, which is old Doctor Who as a sacred text. It was intended to be made in black and white. Colorizing it somehow reduces the impact that it has as a black and white text. And
before you go any further, I was just going to say, you've used that word, and I've seen a bunch of people using that word today, and I want to bring up that word. So do you want to do that word now, or do you want to get into that word later? The word being intended.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the point. So
yeah,
these arguments are the same as the arguments, possibly rightly so, if they chose to colorize The Third Man or colorizing Casablanca. There are people that suggest that, and I'd be one of them, that it somehow works against the intention of the creators, the director, because there's with films like that, there's actually an intent behind the black and white to add atmosphere, or they use black and white. It's like film noir uses black and white in a particular way, but that doesn't translate to Doctor Who. Richard Martin isn't sitting down making the Daleks going, well, I'm making this in black and white, so we have to have extra shadows here, and these costumes have to work really well in black and white, and he's just doing what he can to make it as clear as possible on the small screens, I think. So there isn't that kind of sacred. There's nothing sacred in the black and whiteness of old Doctor Who any more than there's an issue in sort of upscaling or remastering old Doctor Who.
Because it's made in a small television studio on, you know, relatively speaking, cheap video cameras. And cheap video cameras are not going to present contrasts in the way that film cameras do. So you never had that kind of contrast in the first place. That kind of stark, minimalist, sort of German expressionist black and white just doesn't exist in the old Doctor Who's. Even in the film sequences get transferred to video before they get broadcast. So a lot of the distinction that's there in the film sequences is lost before broadcast as well. So you're right. And this is the thing. This is why I object to the word intended, because everybody uses the word intended. They weren't intended to be seen in colour. And that's the thing. Nobody making Doctor Who intended for them to be seen one way or the other. They made them in black and white because television was made in black and white.
And I think intended is important, because I think in some ways people are right that black and white Doctor Who does have a particular atmosphere that colorized it wouldn't. So Mind of Evil, I've always said for many years existed only in black and white, and I actually preferred it in black and white because it had a certain atmosphere. But my point is that's always accidental. That atmosphere it's not auteurs creating film noir and Doctor Who. It's an accidental atmosphere, and that's
I've got another example of that, which is the Tomb of the Cybermen DVD. The first DVD of Tomb of the Cybermen that was put out wasn't vid-fired, and then when they vid-fired it, they put that one out too, which becomes the default because that's how Tomb of the Cybermen was made and therefore intended to be seen. But the non-vid-fired version of Tomb of the Cybermen is so much more atmospheric than the vid-fired version. It stands up like a cheap but nice sort of creaky old sort of atmospheric black and white film.
And with colorization, it's even less of an issue than that, because they're not going to delete the black and white versions and replace them with the colorized versions. No. Colorization is just an extra option if people want to see it, or something that can be broadcast potentially.
Well, and I thought, yes, absolutely. We'll talk about the broadcast in a second, because they did use the word broadcast and some question about what that might mean. I think I want
to know what Brett thinks about colorization.
A bigger question for me, I suppose, and it's not one I know to answer, is are there resources being used on colorization that could go into things like animation instead? And is that a bigger question to ask? Because, you know, you don't want to waste time on something like colorization, which, you know, if you look back at sort of like, I don't know, did they do a colorized version of Metropolis? And they did those Laurel and Hardy ones a long time ago. And I think the agreed wisdom was that it was a bit of a novelty.
But in answer to that question, the people who are colorizing these episodes of Doctor Who would not be animating them if they weren't colorizing them. It's not animators who've been tasked with colorizing the episodes.
But I'm talking about financial, injections.
I wouldn't have said so.
But as far as whether they should exist or not, let them exist, because you've always got the choice to either watch them or not, or watch the black and white originals. So I don't really see a problem. If it's not taking anything away from anyone, unless it is literally taking money away from other, maybe more creative pursuits. But as far as we're aware, that isn't happening. So
no, I will say categorically, I think that absolutely isn't happening, because the way it works is this: each project that BBC Studios embarks upon has to be budgeted for whether that project will bring in money or will be worth the money that was put in terms of what you do with it afterwards. And if they're,
in which case it's a non-argument, because
it doesn't. They're not using money that could have gone to animation. If they think animations can make money, they'll find money for the animations, because they'll expect to make that money back. And if they're thinking they're going to make the money back from the colorizations, they'll find the money for the colorizations. And if they think they're going to make money from both, they'll find money for both, because they're expecting to make that money back. So categorically, one thing does not affect the other in terms of whether it's an either or choice.
So as a segue into the next subject, presumably the couple together,
I don't think we're quite done.
Well, colorization and animation covers all bases, because the animations are obviously for Blu-ray DVD release if they happen, whereas colorization, presumably they could colorize An Unearthly Child and then it becomes broadcastable on.
Just before we move on to that,
forced it exist.
BBC 4 doesn't make its own programming now, but it obviously has a budget for what it will pay to But BBC4 has a budget for what it will pay to program things, and that includes upscaling things to HD so they can go out on BBC4 HD. So BBC4's budget includes making things television ready. So BBC Studios might well have, greenlit sort of colorizing some old black and white Doctor Who's in order to make them broadcast ready so that they can go out on the BBC4 channel. One other thing that was suggested today is that there's a couple of old Hancock's half hours which have been colorized, which are going out on UK TV Gold at some point later this year. UK TV Gold being owned by the BBC. So it's also possible that Doctor Who's being colorized so it could go out on UK Gold.
I mean, if that process had become that automated and that cost effective, then I say why not? I mean, it's an interesting thing. We've seen fan coloured episodes before, haven't we? From the likes of Scott.
And they're really good. They've been really good.
Yeah.
And they do give you a different feel to watching it. It's a different experience. Not necessarily better, but a different experience, I think.
The way I put it is that it feels like watching behind the scenes footage. In other words, you're aware you're not watching the programme as it exists. But what you are getting is, because in colour, I think it brings you a little bit closer to the actors, makes them feel a little bit more like human beings rather than people in this black and white thing that you're watching. And so I think the black and white gives you a distance, and that distance can be an attractive thing. But I think the colorizing of them removes that distance. And so it feels a bit like the behind the scenes thing. When you see a behind the scenes footage, you're more aware of the human beings who are making the program. So I think if you see William Hartnell colorized, I think you become more aware of him as a human being and less as the character. But I like that.
Can I just say something speaking as an artist? A lot of digital artists, their methodology is to create artworks. If you see a painting that supposedly it looks like it's been done in oils, but it's all been done on computer, a lot of the time they'll work in monochrome, in grayscale, and then apply the color afterwards. So there is this is a thing which has become,
it's a precedent set, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And and the end product is such that maybe the trained eye would probably pick up on that maybe some of the hues aren't quite as, but that's down to the abilities of the artist. But
and then you bring people in to sort of go over these things. I think the colorizing, by the sound of it, is probably a bit less work intensive than animation. I would imagine a lot so, and probably therefore cheaper, I would have thought. I mean, I don't know too much about these things, but it certainly feels like colorizing should be cheaper than animating, because with animation you're kind of basically going from scratch, whereas with color you're just applying an overlay to something which already exists. But who knows? And maybe the techniques that they use might make it easier to animate things in future. Maybe that's why animation's back on the cards. I'll just read something out that I wrote earlier on in reply to somebody who said about the intended word. I said, every time one of the animations comes out and there's a color version on one of the discs, there's always a bunch of people who say, oh, I'll never watch the color versions because that's not how it's intended to be seen. And I think, but you'll happily put in the other disc where it's in 16:9, where it's in HD, where it's in stereo, or there's a 5.1 mix, and where it's animated. And none of those things were how it was meant to be seen when it was originally broadcast either. But colour is where you draw the line. And the screenplay's been adjusted to make it more interesting for viewing. Sometimes. Right, let's talk about the other thing. And so I stumbled all over Matt's segue because I don't think we were finished on this. So here's another one instead. I think the power of the Daleks, because it started in black and white, and we all saw the black and white version first, and then we saw the colour version afterwards. And we saw that they colorized it sensitively to the material so that it still did have some of that feeling of a sort of noir thing to it. In fact, maybe even more so than the original television version might have had, given, you know, the sort of restrictions they were working under. So there, I think Power of the Daleks, the colour animated version, is perhaps a good indication of how sensitively they might approach colorizing the old stories. But that brings us to the subject of the animations and the missing episodes. So what Nicola Methven said in this Mirror story was that there were going to be 2 stories animated this year for Blu-ray, DVD, whatever. And she said that she'd heard that there were going to be the Smugglers and the Underwater Menace. And immediately I was sort of, on one hand, happy about the Smugglers, because I think the Smugglers is underrated. But I think the Smugglers is underrated partly because it doesn't exist and because of the lots of location work that it has and the actors who are in it. And I don't think the animation would really compensate for that, but it might give people a better idea of what it's like. So when the Smugglers was mentioned, I was quite happy about that. And then the other one is the Underwater Menace, which 2 episodes missing and 2 episodes existing kind of lends itself to the idea of being animated for DVD. If they're not going to do the whole story, if they perhaps can't afford to do the whole story so that it can be broadcast on BBC America, which was what was happening before. So we had the idea of the Smugglers being 4 episodes to animate and the Underwater Menace being 2 episodes to animate. But as soon as that story came out, people started questioning it, and other people started wondering if perhaps there wasn't hidden information hidden behind the story somewhere anyway. So let's get into that afterwards. But I've just given my initial thoughts. So Simon, on hearing the Smugglers and the Underwater Menace, or on hearing that their animations might be back up and running just at all, what were your first thoughts?
I thought the Smugglers, what a strange choice for an animation. But equally curious because of that. That if they're going to apply that amount of love to a story which doesn't ordinarily get put on a pedestal, then yeah, that's really good news. Underwater Menace, I'm kind of neither here nor there, because it feels like we've had a lot of activity as far as that story is concerned already, and there have already been DVD editions.
That it probably doesn't deserve.
Yeah, quite possibly. So yeah, the Smugglers. Yeah, if it gets to the point where I can enjoy a version of it and get as near as damn it to experiencing the story as intended. No, I didn't say that. Yeah, it's all good. But equally, these are rumours and they feel a little bit airy.
We'll get into that.
If that makes sense.
I want to find out. Yeah, let's find out what Matt's reaction to the actual news was, or the story.
My initial reaction was, I'm glad that they're getting back to animating, because I quite like the animations, and it's nice to have something to buy. So, on top of the Blu-rays and Smugglers makes sense to me. If you're not going to animate Highlanders, which we know that is for whatever reason is an issue for animators because they're allergic to tartan. The Smugglers is the only other sort of historical one that actually feels like a sort of modern story, I think, because it's got that kind of Dr. Sin, smugglers, pirates. It's kind of hidden doors, secret passageways, action adventure. I'm sort of overselling how exciting it is, but it's more modern, I think, than something like the Aztecs or the Crusades, for instance. I don't think it's better, but I think it's, it feels more kind of like a television drama. And like JR, I think it's underrated. I watched Reconstruction a couple of years ago, and I actually watched it all the way through without getting bored, and really liked it, and really wanted to see it in action, whether it be animation or not.
Well, I covered it recently for Mark Cockram and Ian Martin's podcast, and I sat through all 4 episodes of the Reconstruction and then read the Target book without stopping and without getting bored. So that's a mark of the fact that it must at least be an enjoyable story.
Am I right in saying it's plugging a gap as well in the kind of title?
Yeah, sort of, and also because it's the opening story by dint of the broadcast schedule rather than by intention, I think, by the producers. It's also the first story of season 4. And of course, if you're talking about what they could put out on the Blu-rays, I mean, if you were to put out a Blu-ray where 5 of the stories that exist in part or in whole, and sort of 4 of the stories are just there in recons, you're kind of really touching at the edges of whether that's something that's worth putting out, and whether in some ways as well you're not kind of, because the BBC even though these things are put out by BBC Studios, BBC Studios still has to sort of adhere to certain laws which govern the BBC, and something like putting out recons can only really form a tiny part of any product they put out. Otherwise, it might be perceived that the BBC are ripping people off by putting out a product that's sort of not substantial enough to justify the kind of money that they're paying over for it. So I think The Smugglers as well would kind of help get towards a near enough complete season 4 that becomes justifiable on Blu-ray. But then we get down to the point where almost immediately that the story comes out and they say, well, it's the Underwater Menace and it's the Smugglers. Pascal on Gallifrey Base, who's Pascal Zielke, who is a German Doctor Who fan who works in the television industry and thus has enough contacts to know at least some of what goes on sort of behind the scenes. And I think he works for or worked for or had something to do with the television broadcasting station that broadcast Doctor Who, and therefore knows a little bit. Well, he's got contacts, and his initial reaction to the story in the Mirror was, it ain't the Smugglers. Didn't say anything about the Underwater Menace, didn't say the number 2 in terms of how many stories there are wasn't right, but he said it ain't the Smugglers. And I tend to think if he says it's not the Smugglers, that he must have heard quite definitively, even if potentially incorrectly, that the Smugglers is not the story that they're going with. And then it has been said as well that the Mirror sometimes will run with a story, especially a Doctor Who story, that's basically there for clickbait before they've quite got all the facts in order. So they may have heard that the stories were these two, and it may be that one of those two stories has been kind of misrepresented. So this brings us back to another rumour that was doing the rounds about a year ago. I think I should have looked this up. I think it was about a year ago. And when this rumour happened, it was very much big pinch of salt time. So this is not something that's in any way close to being confirmed. And you can't confirm it because, you know, I have contacts inside the restoration team or whatever. What am I going to do? Email one of the restoration team and say, is this thing I've heard true? Because they're not going to say, oh, yes, JR, it is, are they? So what would be the point in asking? So I haven't asked. And my philosophy on the whole thing was, because it's 10 years now since The Web of Fear and Enemy of the World. And oh my God, the rings we've been around talking about and speculating about and hearing rumours about what was going to be next and what was going to be happening and this thing and that thing and the other. And my philosophy now is, oh, it's nice to hear that. If that happens to be true, that's brilliant. But just like Schrodinger's razor or Occam's cat, we aren't going to find out if it's true until such time as we find out that it's true. So nice one to put at the back of your mind and just leave it there until such time as we find out one way or the other if it is true. And I did think, even though this was about a year ago, I did think to myself, we're so close to 2023 that even if this is true, we're probably not going to find out till nearly at the 60th anniversary, because if it's true, they're going to save it till then. Why wouldn't they? They sort of did that by an accident of timing, probably, with Enemy of the World and Web of Fear, but they'd do that again, wouldn't they? And so this is what I heard, and I heard this from two different sources, both of whom were people who are connected enough, and I'm not going to say any more than that, connected enough that it didn't sound to me like bullshit. And that was that
I was Matt.
And that was that 2 individual episodes had been found. From private collectors, I think, was the suspicion. And so, because we know Paul Vanezis has said that there is at least one private collector with a couple of episodes, and then Phil Morris has gone on to say he knows of, I think he said 6 more, which would mean either, if he's including the 2, 6 episodes, or maybe 8 altogether that exist with private collectors, plus Web of Fear episode 3. So we know that there is at least a handful, half a dozen or so episodes in the hands of private collectors that we would hope to get back at some point or another. And I think the suspicion here was that one of these private collectors collectors had handed over the 2 episodes that he was in possession of. And the story was that one of them was from the Crusade and the other one unknown. And then the other story I heard was that both were from the Crusade. And that would mean that if the Smugglers is wrong, then it could well be the Crusade instead, because if that becomes 3 episodes out of 4, then surely you'd animate the 4th one. And if actually it became 4 episodes out of 4, then you could say you were animating the Crusade, so that when rumours about the Crusade started to get about on the missing episodes threads on social media, people would say, oh yeah, that's just because they're animating it. And actually, there was a rumour a couple of months ago from Tim, who, from the Missing Episodes podcast, who had been on a couple of episodes of the Blue Box podcast when we were talking about missing episodes. He said he'd heard that a couple of episodes of The Smugglers were back a couple of months ago, but nobody would corroborate this. And so I think that rumour kind of drifted into the dust too. I would have suggested that maybe stories of animating The Smugglers might have been put out either as a sort of red herring for people who latched onto that story too, or because maybe like the Underwater Menace, it's 2 to animate and 2 to restore because they're already there. But after Pascal said The Smugglers is wrong, that leads me straight back to the Crusade. So here's what I think. Maybe we've got all 4 episodes of the Crusade. Maybe we've got 3 episodes of the Crusade. Maybe the rumor was wrong altogether. But if they're animating 2 of the Underwater Menace and they've got 2 episodes extant, then surely that also makes sense, doesn't it? That with 2 episodes of the Crusade extant, they could animate the other 2. And for sure, season 2 has come out on Blu-ray recently. But, you know, you could always buy the Blu-ray of the animated Crusade and just slot it into your Blu-ray set if that's what takes your fancy. But they weren't going to not put out the season 2 Blu-ray and hold on for the Crusade because that was ready to go. And I think these decisions are kind of sometimes made independently of each other. So there you go. I don't know whether to believe there's 2 episodes back and sort of, you know, this is something that was around at about 12 months ago and never made it onto sort of Twitter, Facebook, major social media platforms. This was always spoken about under people's breath. And so much time has gone. I suspect the people who did believe in it back then have probably stopped believing in it anyway. But like I say, it was always in the back of my head. Well, I probably won't hear any more about this if it's true till 2023. And sure enough, here we are in 2023 and there's rumours about animations. But nevertheless, that's rumours about new old Doctor Who to watch in the 60th anniversary. So I'm aware I've been talking for about 5 minutes without stop. So I'm going to stop, pause for breath. Matt, what do you think?
I mean, it sounds so, in a very convoluted way, the anniversary year kind of makes sense for discoveries to happen, particularly if you're dealing with private holders of these episodes, because Russell T Davies is coming back. The 60th anniversary is clearly being framed as a kind of a reigniting of interest in Doctor Who, or an attempt to sort of flare up interest. If interest flares up, then it means interest in old Doctor Who will flare up, which means there'll be more impetus to spend money on capitalizing on that interest. And if you've got more money, then you can pay these private individuals a bit more money if money is their thing, which you assume money is a thing for them because they've been holding on for so long. It's either money or this kind of weird interest in just having something nobody else has.
Just on that point, BBC aren't allowed by the charter to pay to have episodes returned, so they're not allowed to offer finder's fees. But BBC Studios, I don't believe, is prohibited from doing that.
Yeah, which is why I suggested it was a convoluted connection, because the resurgence of interest presumably has a sort of a domino effect all the way down all the way to Big Finish and Doctor Who magazines. So anything that relies on Doctor Who will at some point get more money, or it has the potential of getting more money, I guess.
Simon, your thoughts? Oh, just before you do, let me just add one more thing to the. Yeah, no, I will come, but I'm going to say something that you might want to respond to anyway. If they found 2 episodes, maybe it's one of the Crusade and one of the Underwater Menace, and therefore there's only 1 episode of each to animate, and surely that's cheaper.
Yeah, No, I was just sort of thinking about this kind of like perceived tantric release system whereby they that sounds wrong, tantric release. It's not that sort of podcast. Oh, it really is. Whereby they will hold on to these releases until such time as it fits in with an anniversary. And is that maybe financially the most wise thing to do? We don't, we've had nothing for 10 years. So they just wait for a big release each time. I'm kind of talking myself into it really now that, that probably is what they would do. If they did have some episodes, they would hold on to them until the optimum moment to release them.
So the 50th, the Web of Fear, felt more like a coincidence that it got to the anniversary, I think, because it depended on when Philip Morris found them. Because it wasn't a case of buying them, it was a case of recovering them and making them ready. And it felt, from memory, it all happened in 1 year, this kind of restoration thing. But I think they would definitely, if it was a financial thing, then they would definitely try to ride a wave they would try to anticipate a wave of popularity for the show with the anniversary, a new Doctor, David Tennant coming back, RTD coming back. Then,
because the other factor involved is how do you release them? Because they could just put them on a streaming platform of some kind, but that's not going to bring you the kind of revenues if you could find some way to package them that makes sense for fans. Because do you remember the fuss about when they found that episode of The Underwater Menace and that episode of Galaxy 4, and there was that fuss? Why can't Galaxy 4, one episode, be put out on a DVD of its own so we can have it on the shelves? And going back to what I was saying earlier, that's the kind of thing that the BBC Charter kind of doesn't allow them to do, because somebody might walk into HMV, pick up a DVD of Galaxy 4 and find there's only 25 minutes of the 100 on there, and they might be a little bit peed off about that. So in the end, they put that episode on a re-release of The Aztecs that didn't come out for months and months later, and fandom were up in arms about it. So even if they found 2 orphaned episodes, they've got to figure out the way that they can release them, that they can package them up so that fans will want to buy them. And they discovered when they released The Web of Fear and The Enemy of the World is if you can sort out the package that you're going to release them in first, and then make the announcement and make the package available, even if just a pre-order right there and then, that generates a hell of a lot more excitement and sales than if you'd have just said, well, we found The Web of Fear and, it'll be out in a year if we can get around to it.
But hopefully they'll learn from the Web of Fear, because they produced that package, but the extra missing episode was reconstructed terribly for that initial release.
Well, that's why I'm thinking now we're looking at, this is why the animation thing is. I mean, this is if these 2 episodes even have been handed back. We know some episodes exist. What we're talking about is whether those episodes are still in the hands of private collectors or whether they are back at the BBC. And maybe with the anniversary on the horizon, maybe a year ago, the people who negotiate with these collectors have just a little bit more incentive to actually get something done about it. Because Paul Vanessas, I think, has always kind of said, look, they're in the hands of the collectors. We have made our position clear to these people, and then it's up to them, and you can't put pressure on them. But I think with an anniversary on the cards, maybe you can bring just a little bit more pressure to bear. Who knows?
I wondered whether it was a Celestial Toymaker episode on the way back, in as much as Stephen Moffat included the Great Intelligence in a story to kind of coincide with the return of Web of Fear. So
I think,
it's an outside bet. It's an outside bet, but I did wonder.
It's tempting to think that, but I suspect that the Celestial Toymaker is just because he had Neil Patrick Harris and he was trying to think, well, what do we do with Neil Patrick Harris? Is either the Master or something a bit more interesting. And we've had how many Masters in the last sort of 10, 15 years? So let's try and find something more interesting for him to do. And I think the Toymaker lends itself to Neil Patrick Harris having fun in the part. So I think that's probably just coincidence, but you never know. Right, anything more that either of you two wants to add? Okay, well,
I hope the animations are good.
Yeah. Fingers crossed.
Well, the technology keeps improving, right? So, I mean, yeah, fingers crossed. Right, until we come back next week to talk about the sort of backlash to this episode, I was JR.
I was Matt.
I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon.